Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Hyde, and I'm a director at BIE, where I lead the search practice in our business transformation team. Alongside me is Gareth, also a director here at BIE. He works in our procurement team, and we will be co-hosting today's discussion. For those of you who don't know about BIE, we're an executive recruitment firm that's been building leadership and enabling change for over 2 decades. Through a combination of interim management, permanent resourcing, and transformation expertise across 5 broad market functions, we empower our clients to adapt, plan, and deliver change. And as political leaders gather in Egypt at COP27 this week, we wanted to host an event exploring ESG, given the importance of the topic. And one of the main themes coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh is the need for increased regulation to tighten up on greenwashing. There's concern about the damage greenwashing is creating for the route to net zero, and this will only mean greater scrutiny of corporates. ESG therefore creates significant risks for organisations alongside massive opportunities and requires long-term strategic thinking from boards and senior executives. Indeed, ESG-focused initiatives are likely to become the biggest drivers of organisational transformation in the future, but developing and delivering appropriate strategies is far from straightforward. Accordingly, how to create and implement a successful ESG strategy has become a prevalent theme across our network. This has been the case for our finance and procurement leaders in particular, which is why I'm delighted to welcome our 3 panelists today. They're all experts in their respective fields, and we're very grateful for them taking the time out of their busy schedules for this conversation. They'll be sharing their first-hand experiences within their organisations and discussing who should be responsible for driving ESG strategies forwards and deciding where and how businesses should invest in ESG. The webinar will last around 45 minutes, and please submit your questions at any point via the Q&A function. We will endeavour to cover the questions as we go through the conversation and answer those outstanding at the end. The session will be recorded and shared afterwards, along with a write-up of the key takeaways. I'll now pass you over to Rachael, who I will ask to be the first of our guests to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here today to be able to engage in this important topic. So my name is Rachael Legg. I'm an executive with a career spanning some 30 years, gained from broad industry experiences, including FMCG, industrial chemical, retail, and consumer electronics. And that's been in the disciplines of engineering, supply chain, procurement, business change, and transformation. I'm also a board trustee, a finance governance committee member with charity Pancreatic Cancer Action. That's something very close to my heart. And I'm a global board trustee with the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, SIPS, with whom I'm also a fellow. And I'm a member of the advisory board with procurement leaders. And the last 4 years, I've been privileged to be recognised as an influential procurement leader on the SIPS Power List. And I'm also crazy enough to be studying for my executive MBA with Warwick Business School with a focus on ESG and organisational performance, because as a CPO, I'm not busy enough already. So for the 7 years before joining sustainable technologies company Johnson Matthey, so JM, that's where I am today, I enjoyed running my own procurement, business change and transformation consultancy, working with clients including digital marketing company Hyde, they were formerly Yell.com, packaging paper recycling company DS Smith, professional services company Capita, alcohol beverages company Diageo, and snacking foods company Pladis. Now in JM, I have found a company that's absolutely passionate about making the world cleaner and healthier today and for future generations, very much focused on driving down transport emissions, decarbonising chemicals production, transforming our energy systems, and creating a truly circular economy. So in 2018, I joined JM as their first chief procurement officer to lead the transformation from what was then a decentralised and immature procurement organisation to one that is now sustainably enabling profitability, driving growth and ensuring protection as JM catalyses the transition to net zero. But in January of this year, I start my next CPO leadership adventure in renewable energy with Lightsource BP, who's a global leader and BP partner who develop, finance, build and operate responsible utility scale solar power projects for countries, communities and companies. And that's to enable the rapid scale up to help meet the rising demand for renewable electricity, whilst also supporting the global energy transition to net zero. So, let's think about ESG. So ESG is often used interchangeably with corporate social responsibility, CSR, or corporate sustainability. However, ESG these days encompasses much more. It considers the environmental factors such as climate change, natural resource scarcity, and pollution and waste, the social factors such as community engagement, responsible sourcing, and considers those risks from human capital management, product service safety, and human rights and labour management. And then from a governance factor perspective, including the quality, diversity, and effectiveness of our boards, of our companies, reporting, transparency, business ethics, and indeed the executive compensation. So when I think about, how I have become involved in ESG, so I only need to look back across my career and consider the evolution of ESG to where we would recognise it today. Broadly speaking, that in the 1980s, the focus was really around EHS, so the environment, the health, and safety. And that was sort of based on the development of environmental and employee relations. Then in the 90s, we referred to it as sustainability, which was focused on reducing environmental impacts beyond those sort of legal requirements. Then in the early 2000s, corporate philanthropy came in, and that whole employee volunteerism was used to align the social issues, which we better known as CSR. And then in recent years, ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, has sort of come into its own as a holistic concept relating to competitive advantage and risk and reward management. So my career has been both sort of influenced by each of these evolution steps, and it indeed has sort of influenced organisations in driving towards their intended aspirations. Now, in the context of my role as Chief Procurement Officer here at Johnson Matthey, well, work continues on business continuity with supply failure risk management, especially with tightening supply in some areas, including labour and indeed potential energy shortages, as well as working with mission critical suppliers to build resilience from climate change in their manufacturing and distribution capabilities. And across the supply base, procurement is also driving delivery of externally communicated commitments around human rights, so to uphold our human rights in our value chains, and indeed to play a critical role in achieving net zero by 2040 in our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We're also mobilising our supplier engagement and diversity agenda, partnering with organisations such as Tilbrook and MSD UK. And it also gives us an opportunity to engage with those social value organisations like Wild Hearts Group, who through their activities and profits can really create that global social change. And then from a diversity, equality and inclusion perspective, and especially gender equality within JM, it continues to be an important ESG topic for me, where we've now have gender balance across our procurement leadership team and 43% of women across the function. And, we've consciously addressed those historical gender pay gaps. So with that, I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And JP, you're up next.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And also thank you for having me here on this esteemed panel. So yeah, quick bit of background about myself. So I'm currently the interim CFO at Colliers for EMEA. So Colliers, if you're not familiar with them, they are the world's number 3 or 4 commercial real estate firm. So you might have heard from CBRE and Jones Lang LaSalle. So they're sort of the next one. And yeah, present in about 40 countries in the EMEA space. Now, before that, I spent about 18 years actually at Shell, where I worked in a variety of different finance leadership roles in Asia, North America, and in Europe, including CFO for Shell's big petrochemical complex in Rotterdam. I was also head of planning reporting for one of its divisions. I spent about 5 years in M&A. And the last few years really focused on business turnaround and transformation. So I was involved in and led a lot of asset turnaround projects where you drive rapid transformation across the company. So I led this for Shell's downstream business for the last year. And that was really about how do you quickly get a lot of existing assets to rapidly improve, and that was both financially but also a number of ESG aspects, so CO2, energy efficiency, waste management, where things have sort of started to grow up into that. So then I did a similar role for a year at Aramco, where also engaging on rapid business transformation around some of their subsidiaries. And separately, and this is on the side, I'm also on the board and currently president of the Biophysical Economics Institute, which is a US-based nonprofit with some leading academics in the sustainability and ecology space, and also some people from the financial industry, fund managers and equity research analysts from the city and Wall Street, and that is it's an unpaid role, but this is very much focused on taking, if you like, science-based views on sustainability and injecting that into corporate decision making. And it's very much geared around, well, how do you cut through the greenwashing, but also some of the well-intended but ultimately not particularly effective practices that are also going around there just by kind of skipping the science step in all of that. So that's certainly something that gives me energy, and that is something that I feel there's a lot of potential here in terms of how do you inject that more science-based view on sustainability, and together also with that value lens in corporates, which certainly as a CFO, which is where my background sits, is important. I feel that there's a lot of potential in terms of how do you take some of the goals and aspirations and concepts from the ESG space, but link and integrate that into strategy and performance management in companies and approaches like transformation to actually get stuff done and get real impact rather than talk about it or feel good about it. And I think that's certainly something that motivates me, and I'm keen to have the opportunity to discuss this a bit further.
Perfect. Thank you, JP. I'll now hand over to Nick.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Stewart. Thanks very much for having me on the panel. So I'm a partner at Baringa. Baringa Partners are a 1,500-person global management consulting firm. A little bit about me and my background, particularly in the ESG journey. So I've spent half my career in consulting. Prior to Baringa, I was a partner at EY for 5 years, and I spent half my career in industry. So I've been like JP in finance. I was in finance roles within financial services, and then I moved into more business roles. My journey on this topic is very much driven by, I've always been at the forefront of regulatory change and evolving regulations, for whether I was in industry or on the client advisory side. And so, unlike Rachael, who's got an extremely strong heritage in this topic, I only came to be more detailed involved in climate change in particular about 4 years ago when I joined Baringa. And that really coincided with Mark Carney's efforts when he was at the Bank of England about getting climate as a topic that really is at the forefront of what boards are thinking about and investors are thinking about. And some of you will know we were the first country in the UK to have the first ever global climate stress test. That was something that my colleagues and myself at Baringa helped many of our clients through. So really, although Baringa has been around for 22 years, advising clients on the energy transition and all things related to climate, my particular journey is probably really accelerated in the last 4 years. And as I'll talk about today, my big kind of thought in this area is that whether you're focused on the bottom line and opportunity, I see a tremendous amount of opportunity to monetize and make money, as well as doing good things for the people, for the planet, for the bottom line. Baringa, I think we're still the only consulting firm that are a B Corp. So we're very focused not just on profit, but also on people and planet, and thinking about not just with our people, but also with our clients, how we can really help them understand, manage, and measure kind of climate and sustainability. So look forward to the discussion, and hopefully we'll have lots of questions to go through.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, all. So Nick, we'll start with you, actually, because I think your view across industry will be hugely helpful here with, I think, the starting point, really, which is on ownership. And we've seen it bounce around a number of different corporate functions for a host of different reasons. So you'll see lots of different operating models, and we've been debating which function should lead on the ESG agenda. Is there a theme to who you see currently taking the lead, and is there one in particular that you think should take ownership?
Yeah, it's a great question, as you say, Alex. I think it's evolving. I guess the first thing I would say is I don't really care which of my clients puts it at the forefront of their agenda. The main thing is it is at the top of the agenda. One of the things we're talking a lot with clients at the moment is it's not about setting a sustainability strategy that's on the side of your strategy. It's about having a sustainable strategy as a business. And I think I touched on financial services. I think in financial services, because you have the regulators, stress testing, you often see the risk and finance teams kind of leading on it alongside the chief sustainability officer, and obviously colleagues like Rachael on the procurement and supply chain are very key. But when I talk to many of my corporate clients, they often don't have as sophisticated a risk management structure. So I think, and I'm slightly biased because I spend a lot of time talking to CFOs, so I'm sure others will have views, but I think the CFO function is critical. And there's three reasons for that. One, I think climate is all about, in particular, climate as part of ESG. And I think many would agree that the E in ESG is getting more traction now, but the others will come on board as well. And then you can get into things like nature and biodiversity. But when I particularly think about climate, there is a real need to set a realistic transition plan to net zero, to then set targets, and then to manage those targets within the organization. Whether you're a company that manufactures goods, whether you're an Amazon distributing content and products, whether you're a Vodafone that's selling mobile phones, I think the onus is on the CFO to really think about how they embed targets and manage those targets within an organization. That often falls to the CFO. The second thing I would say is around data and tools. I think, like any major change, I think climate and sustainability, and particularly carbon, is going to become, and it's already for many companies, and JP comes from the energy sector, so we'll know this, it's a major constraint about managing emissions. So one of the reasons I think the CFO is a good owner is the CFO often is responsible for the capital plan, for strategy, for the management information. And I think a lot of that tooling and data needs to come from the CFO office and with other functions. And then the third one, then I'll pause, I'm sure my colleagues have views, is when you think about engaging with the market, you often think about results day. We've seen at COP just this week, there's more focus put on the new accounting sustainable standards from the ISSB. The CFO is often the person that stands up at results day, talks to investors, manages relations with investor relations, thinks about the capital stack of the business. So picking up on JP's point, one of the big risks around ESG is greenwashing. How can you show to your investors, to your stakeholders, that you are managing those risks? And I think, again, that is something that falls to the CFO and their function.
Gareth, you're on mute.
Thank you. Well, it wouldn't be a Zoom call without someone being on mute and speaking, right? So, yeah. So Rachael, we've talked about this for some time, and clearly a very strong advocate of ESG. And from your lens, from a CPO lens, what is your view?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Nick's comment that the ESG agenda needs to be sort of interwoven into the business as usual, rather than this sort of barnacles set on the side. It just won't work like that. But I think aside from ESG being the sort of the right thing to do, corporate pressures and the expectation of stakeholders, so that's anyone who's affected by or can affect the business, we know that they're increasing, and managing those stakeholders is important, because creating value for them together with stakeholder capitalism, they're drivers for capital allocation and investment. So those internal stakeholders, for example, company owners and employees, and then externally, customers, investors, communities, etc., including supply partners. So, the quality of these relationships can dictate the company's ability to manage risks and opportunities. So effective stakeholder management is also supporting that crisis response and business continuity planning, which, I'm sure if there's lots of CPOs and procurement teams on the call, they'll attest to these in the last few years of the black swan events that we've been having. So, stakeholder welfare is intrinsically linked with corporate profitability, and that's why ESG makes good business sense. So the focus really is around it's essential that the most effective relationship owner is identified for each stakeholder group across the value chain, together with sort of effective collaboration and those handoff points between each of those owners. So I do think that at a company level, the chief executive should have that overall ESG accountability together with the board. And then, when considering the supply partner stakeholders, many companies have got thousands, if not like ourselves, sort of tens of thousands of suppliers. And then depending on the industry as well, you can have anywhere between 10% to half of your group revenue flowing to those, to those supply partners for materials, goods and services. So, this is both an opportunity in terms of innovation and creation of social value, for example, but indeed, it does also pose a range of, what potentially could be significant sort of business continuity risks. So when I consider procurement, so procurement is the business management function, and our role is to anticipate, ensure identification, sourcing, access to, and manage those external resources that a company needs or may need to profitably and responsibly fulfill strategic objectives. So that's our reason to exist. So it won't surprise you that certainly for the supply partner relationships, I think that the chief procurement officer should lead that aspect of the ESG agenda. That doesn't matter whether you're a B2B organization, so business to business, supply chains are considered part of the company's footprint and, respective impacts, where the supply chain partner sort of ESG maturity itself is key to both, the customer acquisition for the supplier and also the corporate risk management. And, the same is true for business to consumer, so B2C organizations, all often with greater demand of that value chain transparency and standards. And, here procurement can drive this sort of upstream right back to source. So they're important aspects. And just a brief further point for consideration is that the world isn't always in these sort of neat straight lines, and increasingly we're seeing sort of complex ecosystems of parties that need to come together. And this was very much the case for us in JM when we were establishing the JM battery materials business. So, care must be taken in selecting the most appropriate sort of orchestrator of these participants in that context too.
Perfect. Yeah, great. And I mean, complete agreement there. And JP, from your side, you've operated both B2C, B2B, and an operated CFO. So, what is your view from a finance lens?
Yeah, I think some of the items that Nick and actually Rachael raised that touch on some of that. I would think that in a way, who exactly leads it in the executive team is to some extent secondary to the more fundamental point, which is it really integrated with strategy and performance management in the company, right? And if anything, I think it's a little what is dangerous if you say, look, the CEO owns it because it's important and the board owns it, and then you say, and therefore there is this special ESG person now on my leadership team who separately does it on his own, right? As if it was some sort of external relations or marketing thing. And I think that I would say is dangerous. Fundamentally, it touches on risk and value, like Nick says, right? And risk and value, of course, is something that the CFO should primarily care about the risk and value for the whole company, and it is about how do you then integrate the ESG type aspects that tie to risk and value in how you run the company, right? And obviously you need specialist expertise on aspects of it, and that needs to sit somewhere in the executive team, and whether that's the CFO or the COO or some other place, I think, or it is diverged, split across the different areas because of unique procurement aspects sitting there, and you've got other aspects on the customer side. I think that's secondary. I think the big thing is about integrating it in your strategy, linking it to risk and value, and really thinking about, well, how do you measure this, right? Do you understand your gap to potential in that regard? How do you go about after closing that? How do you monitor the rate at which people are closing those gaps? And ultimately, I think that helps you to run a company that looks at it both as an opportunity and a risk to manage actively, rather than something to look good, right? Because that's not the way to have impact, I believe.
Yeah, completely agree. And what's the common thread for an organization to successfully ingrain, I suppose, ESG principles? And I suppose what would the successful organizations do differently to those that ultimately have struggled to really ingrain ESG? That's for the panel. So I suppose either of you could take that question.
I start, and then we can chip in with any extra ones. I think, I mean, there's a number in no particular order. I think it really does help actually to, number one, if you've got a diverse board, in many ways, including all their backgrounds, because, they're essentially then they're representing the diverse customers and communities that your organization is serving. So I think that is absolutely key, which then sort of flows, the tone from the top in the leadership. So perhaps I'll do one, and then, we can pass around the panel for any others.
Perfect. Nick?
I mean, my big thing, agree with everything that's been said. We're actually doing some work, if you get specific, we're doing work at the moment on what we call credible transition plans. So looking at the transition plans of the largest corporates, and obviously that will come down to smaller companies. One of the things we look at is, and I know because we've just looked at recently, if you look at someone like Shell, they've implemented a bold net zero strategy, and they've also linked it to remuneration. And we all know that remuneration is and not just remuneration of the board, actually remuneration of their 16,000 employees. Now, I'm sure the skeptics amongst us will say, well, Shell have exploited, the energy crisis and made billions, so they can afford to do that. But I think that point, Rachael said it about, governance and accountability at the board. And if you're in a regulated sector, you get that from a regulator. We now have the Financial Conduct Authority that's going to pick up on greenwashing, not just for financial services, but for all companies. And then that accountability in scorecards, remuneration, I think, is a big factor. So I guess there would be the couple of points I would say about how you kind of really embed it. And the last point, which JP touched on as well, is then how do you embed it through capital planning, financial targets. I often think, when I think about the climate aspects, I often think about it, you often think about revenue and cost management, but I think carbon becomes another one of those constraints. So if through your business, you can allocate that target across the business lines, the revenue generating parts of the business, which we're seeing some of the more leading companies doing, I think, again, you'll see that effective implementation on the topic.
I'd completely agree with that, Nick, and that's something, both of those topics is something that we're doing in JM. So right way through the management layers, we've got that in our PSPs, for example, and in our all of our incentive structures actually, and it's increasingly moving that way down through the organisation. And then also part of that sort of annual budgeting and strat planning cycle, it's not just about finance now, it's actually about carbon reduction targets, and we have that down to site. And sort of in that space as well, we were very clear that actually we came together to develop the ESG strategy as the senior leadership across the company. So all of our senior leaders had an opportunity to sort of debate and challenge if we were focusing on the right material, areas of importance, and also aligning on the measures and the targets from that point of view. And that was hugely engaging. Actually, it really energized the whole leadership of the group organization. So that was really important. And then next was about having a common language and a common way that we're going to do this, right? So a common way of measurement. And I appreciate there's not complete standards across everything everywhere, but certainly within our organization, we took what was available, and we kind of run with that. And so we've got a consistent way of measuring, and we baseline and we report each month, and it's to all of our business leaders. We can see it right down to site, etc. So we're really clear with where we are, where we're trying to get to. It's very clear in terms of we've clarified ownership and accountability expectations for each of the ESG strategies and work streams, so we know who's on point for that, and everybody has clarity in terms of what their contributing factor is to be able to drive that. So that's been really important for us to be able to move it forward. So that whole transparency, every part of the business can see how they're tracking versus others, which creates sort of healthy competition. That has also been really, really important. And I guess my sort of final 2 points would be about borrowing with pride, and not to necessarily invent everything from scratch. Use industry conventions and standards, what others are doing, just because it's important that we make progress over perfection. The clock's ticking, so it's better just to start if you're not already started. Work with what you have, get going, and just develop it from there.
Yeah, and if I were to build on that, right, because I agree with that, and indeed starts with a good strategy. Make sure that's integrated with value rather than just a sustainability strategy or just an ESG strategy, because that's just frankly not helpful. It's not an add-on that you say is important, but it needs to be integrated with how you run the company. And then as you do that, it's also then about integrating it with your entire performance management framework, right? So it's how people are paid, but also how people are appraised and how performance is monitored, where you do ultimately see the sustainability related sort of items, whether it's CO2 emissions or reductions, just integrated next to financial sales sort of value margin targets, right? And that helps people look at it in an integrated way as well, which is important, because as a company, you don't want somebody to spend a huge amount to mitigate a relatively small degree of carbon, for instance, where there's another part of the company where for much less you can have a much bigger bang for the buck in terms of carbon reduction, as an example, right? And I'm picking on carbon now. There's obviously much more to it, but I think having that framework out there, and also in a way that goes pretty deep into the organization, so that people who come up with specific ideas and need to figure out, hey, is this particular improvement initiative going to get funded, get the company support, and then having a practical avenue for getting that decision made quickly, move forward, and being held accountable for it, and giving the recognition for that. I think that's a key part to move fast, because I find a lot of companies struggling maybe a bit with aspects where they say, hey, I want to really make a progress in this space, but they look at it as a almost like an insular improvement thing that sits on its own. And I think that the key bit to really drive impact at scale is to make this broad-based and having it not just hit your new shining area of the company that is really sustainable, but also the dirty, old, boring part that actually has a lot of potential for improvement as well, and recognize people accordingly, and make sure they focus the effort on the stuff that makes an impact.
Great, thank you. And another topic that continues to come up in our network is board investment, and this almost reflects the recent survey that we recently produced, where 90% of respondents suggested that they believe ESG investment will produce improved business results in the next 5 years. But only 50% mentioned that the board have a clear ROI on the investment. So, Rachael, maybe if you could take this one.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think it's good. It's good that 90% of the respondents, believe that actually, that it will drive business results. So that's sort of hope for the future. And I guess, if they think that sort of 50% that their board has a sort of a clear return on investment, Perhaps the board are working on it. I hope the board are working on it. Perhaps they haven't really engaged or communicated it out to the business. But you know, from a JM point of view, you know, our vision is for a cleaner and healthier world. So it's kind of in our DNA. So I guess I've probably had a bit of an easier ride, you know, at JM around engaging our board on these topics. You know, especially for our products and services, you know, it's very much in our DNA, and we do have an enlightened board. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, I think that's largely down to the diversity of background being one of those key enablers. But, you know, so ESG, you know, it's got a significant positive impact on fundamental business issues, you know, corporate reputation, risk reduction, opportunity management, and, you know, that culture and intrinsic value. And it's really relevant to the long-term success of any company across industry. So really to sort of take it forward, it's key to identify what is material to your organization. So considering, you know, corporate reputation, you know, ESG has enhanced, you know, it can enhance a company's sort of license to operate, making it easier to accomplish business objectives and respond to, you know, crisis scenarios with key stakeholder groups. You know, if we think about examples like Cambridge Analytica back in 2018, you know, Facebook lost billions in market value due to tarnished reputation in managing cybersecurity attacks. Now, cybersecurity is something that, you know, can you know, affect any organization. So, you know, from a procurement's role, you know, it's clearly about setting out expectations to suppliers. We do that through supplier code of conducts. We conduct supplier due diligence, you know, create trusting relationships and transparency of those key risk areas for mitigation. And certainly, you know, I found that educating the board with a kind of a state of the nation, you know, giving them an oversight of, you know, what's going on in our supply chains and our value chains, and then engaging them in discussion on areas of greatest concern to me, you know, in delivering the business strategy. That's been hugely beneficial, you know, given the wealth and diversity of their experience they bring. So that's been, you know, hugely valuable to us. From a risk reduction point of view, you know, ESG helps identify both immediate and long-term risks. And sometimes the long-term risk, you know, you need to start now to be able to turn the oil tanker, if you will, to be able to mitigate that, you know, whether that's key materials or evolving regulations. And, you know, and that really will depend on the industry and the business model. You know, and similarly in JM, you know, I've engaged the board in supply failure scenario and risk mitigation discussions, again, by providing that oversight and in specific insight into our supply base and our mission critical value chains, and linking that through not just from a supply side, but what's the impact, the potential impact on revenue and indeed on our growth strategy. You know, that's been a key linkage for them. So, you know, when I started back in JM in 2018, I have to say, when I put this on the table, this got the full attention of both the board and the executive, and that's led to, you know, really proactive mitigation activities, which has served us incredibly well, as you know, to enable us to navigate the significant events that we all know now around the pandemic, labour shortages, Suez Canal blockage, climate change, energy crisis, you know, inflation impact, you know, take your pick. So, you know, it served us very well. And then when we think about opportunity management, you know, arguably this is one for the commercial teams, you know, by shifting market and non-market conditions, it can expose sort of unmet needs for new products and services, or, you know, underserved or unserved customer bases and strategic relationships for addressing the ESG issues. So, you know, it can create additional benefit there. And then, you know, with culture and intrinsic value, well, you know, ESG maturity is an indicator of a company's commitment to building a high performing, purpose-driven workforce and inclusive culture. So from an investor perspective, you know, integrating ESG factors into valuations allows for greater insight into those intangible factors of culture, talent, you know, recruitment, retention, operational excellence, etc., that can improve investment outcomes. And certainly, you know, procurement, we often get asked, you know, questions like a lot of functions do, you know, we get asked questions from the investor community. So I guess if I summarised it, sort of the return on investment for board with an effective ESG strategy is really is around sort of enhanced customer and investor acquisition, clearly around, you know, reduced disruptions and losses, you know, greater workforce productivity and organizational resilience, and it identifies those new market customers and product services and revenue streams. And frankly, if that doesn't get the board's attention, perhaps nothing will.
So Rachael, and that touches seemingly on a question that's come in from Lucy Singer, which is around the KPIs that you put in place to measure ESG targets. So that would be the focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to direct you to page 216 of our annual report, if I may, because there's a good number of them, but they're all in there. I'll drop the link. I'll drop the link in here.
Thank you. And then Gareth, do we have you on audio? I think we may have lost Gareth there. And Nick, I mean, we've been discussing as part of these conversations, how monetization is key to measuring corporate environmental performance. And can you elaborate on how this can be a key lever to influence them?
Yeah, I mean, in my intro, I talked about, revenue and products and the opportunity to monetize, which I think is key. I mean, I'll give you a micro example. I have 3 daughters. One of my daughters loves Ella's Kitchen puff snacks. I don't know if any of you who are parents probably have sampled them. They're delicious.
But yeah.
But Ella's Kitchen's a client we worked with quite extensively at Baringa. They're a B Corp. They're passionate about sustainability. I'm very happy as a customer to pay more for my daughter's snacks because I know they're a sustainable product that runs through the business. So I think for all of us, whether it's in our day-to-day lives, it's the clothes we buy, the food we buy, we're always looking now much more at that sustainability label. My 5-year-old even can see B Corp, signs on other products when we're going, in the shops and stuff. But if I think about a more macro example, one of the things we've done at Baringa about 4 years ago, we helped clients to start managing and assessing climate risk in particular. And we built a leading model that helps you do scenario analysis and long-term modeling. And that model now has been taken on in partnership with BlackRock. And when you look at any company, and I'm sure we've got many people in the audience today that are reliant on public markets or private markets for debt and raising finance, the reality is that both climate change and broader sustainability metrics are starting to be factored into how the capital markets price and manage debt. So just to give an example, we often look at a corporate's debt position, we look at their riskiness, and if you overlay a climate angle, because it's a bit easier to manage climate than it is some of the other metrics now, even a small movement in riskiness due to climate can lead to significant P&L costs or financing costs on a business. And we all know, coming through the recent energy crisis, we've seen the rate rises, particularly in the UK and broader markets, that any company or individual is very focused on cost of debt and financing. So I think it's a great thing. Now we're starting to see these metrics, Rachael talked on it, put into how analysts look at company. We're seeing the rating agencies come out with ESG ratings. We're starting to measure these things. It means that it ultimately will go to the bottom line because it's going to impact not just your revenue, but also your cost of running the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And JP, what have you seen kind of drive forward the investment in your time at Shell and Aramco? I guess as organisations that are on the front line, there's more importance. It'd be really good to understand how it took place there.
Yeah, and I do think indeed there's quite a bit of a variety of how high it is on the agenda, and certainly within the energy industry, this is really top of mind, right? Because it is business continuity aspect, but also massive value opportunities, right? I mean, if you look at it, and that is, and I think that's fundamentally the way to look at it, right? So there's obviously a big risk aspect, right? Are you going to end up with stranded or massively curtailed assets, right? And do you understand where your risk sits, and are you fast enough to act on that, right? Because imagine selling refineries nowadays is a heck of a lot harder than it was 10 years ago, right? And therefore, were you well enough? Were you smart enough upfront to see this risk materializing so you could act early enough on this, right? And then I see it now in Colliers in the real estate business, which is this is more towards clients, but if you're a pension fund and you're investing in an office building, how much at risk are you of this becoming a stranded asset as government regulations tighten, because the energy profile of the asset isn't as strong, right? And if you're an investor, you understand as well. You can just simply make smarter decisions. So as a board, typically, I think risk is one driver. The other big driver is indeed value, right? And that is about where does the business opportunity sit in there, and here, and I feel this is some companies are a little bit late to the party on that one, which is to really spot the opportunity, right? And I'm not so much talking about my own old companies, but maybe a bit more generically is I've seen a lot of people approaching this from the perspective, hey, our investors care about it, and or I'm suddenly not getting funding anymore, so I should care about it, and therefore I got to respond and have a story, and I'm starting to do something about it, rather than the other way around, to say, hey, this is a changing market environment. How can I turn this into business opportunities for me, right? How can I turn around my business model to thrive in this environment? How can I spot the opportunities in the Colliers space? How can I be really smart in how I engage with pension funds who are investing in big office buildings, so that they can have an edge and deeper understanding, so that they know which are the ones you could invest in and maybe make more efficient, and therefore you know that you're gonna have the potential to sell it for more later down the road, as opposed to hoping for the best and closing your eyes on it, right? And I find that, and maybe the one other angle to it, because that's one that I've seen up close also quite in a big way, is there's by simple sort of more operational excellence on your base businesses, there's a huge potential also for enhancing value and sustainability hand in hand, right? Doing things in a smarter, more efficient way tends to save money and improve the CO2 energy footprint of your operation, right? And doing that hand in hand, rather than as a separate thing that you worry about separately and report out on separately. I think that's the key, and I think that also gets the board excited if you can have that integrated story, how you bring it together.
And where did you encounter the most resistance when trying to put that transformation in place? Because I guess there's an understanding of the strategic importance of it moving forward, but then the reality of putting that in place is difficult, right? So where did you encounter the most resistance, and how did you overcome it?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure about resistance per se, but what you tend to see is that people look at it as a bit of a separate topic that they want to address separately, and they will address it then through portfolio moves, like selling certain parts of the company, buying different assets, starting up new business lines. But less, if you like, less people struggling a bit to inject this into base operations in an effective way. And I think that's where companies struggle a bit, because that requires, of course, change of lots of people in relative to how they used to work, right? And I think there you get into a little bit of business transformation. Well, how do you take effective, proven methods for rapidly turning around a business and have them not just focus on value, but inject some of those sustainability elements into that, so you can then sort of impact stuff at scale, rather than just talk about the portfolio high level stuff and your new green business ventures that you may be starting up. So I think the key and also the challenge is integrating it into the base activity. And I think that's a lot of companies are struggling, because it's harder. It involves more people need to change, right?
Absolutely. And Rachel, then how much crossover is there with that to your experience of transitioning to a more sustainable value chain at JM?
Sorry, can you repeat that? It just dropped out literally just as you were starting to speak. Say that again.
The question was, I guess what similarities are there with that within your journey to a more sustainable value chain at JM?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Nobody's got this solved, I think, is the key thing to sort of say out there. I speak to a lot of people, and sometimes you can be intimidated by companies that are sort of further ahead. The important thing is that you start. And as I say, the key thing as well for me when I'm engaging with the business, because they are focused on operational things as well as the board, as stakeholder groups themselves, is around materiality. What's most important. I think one of the areas that is really front and center right now is about the diversification of our supply base. If you think about it, especially in procurement terms, it's the globalization. You hear that sort of phrase. The trend always used to be about globalizing all of our supply chains, but I think we've seen some of the challenges around that. Not least, examples are in the war on Ukraine, for example. So that is one of the areas. There's huge opportunities for us as we look to de-risk the business, but also to really drive forward the whole ESG agenda, in particular when we're looking at, okay, what's the footprint and the future footprint of any organization, but also the supply chains that go with it. So certainly one of the things that we're looking at is, where does it make sense for us to actually localize the supply base again? So there's we just literally let your mind run riot from a creativity point of view, but there's a huge amount of value that we can unlock by doing it. And it also plays, it gives opportunity to developing new suppliers in the markets. So there are, if I even think about solar, where I'm heading to next, right? We know that in excess of 80% of the entire value chain comes out of China. And there's challenges with that, whether it's geopolitical challenges, etc., but also from an environmental, from an ESG perspective. So, thinking through that sort of lens does create opportunities for creating new industries, actually, in other parts of the world.
Perfect, thank you, Rachael. And Nick, just as a kind of final point before we get on to the Q&A, clearly this year's been one full of disruption. And what impact have you seen on that? With your clients in terms of their focus on ESG initiatives? Has it detracted from them? Has it focused attention more upon moving forward in this direction?
Yeah, I remain optimistic. I think the topic has stayed at the top of agendas, but I think there's no doubt that both in financial services but also in corporate markets, I'm thinking particularly around some of the more price elastic sectors, consumer products and retail, that short-term events have occupied people's minds. But I mean, if you look at the reason we're in a crisis, right? We've got a global energy problem caused by the Russia and Ukraine events, and you hear in the UK and in Europe, many and the US as well talk about it. We need to have having a secure and robust energy supply is all around, and I love your phrase, Rachael, the globalization, but is all around countries, companies and individuals becoming more sustainable, right, in terms of how we operate. So in the UK, for example, as Rachael said, huge amount of focus on renewable energy, solar and wind. And I think as a nation, we've done a good job. We're a tiny little island, but I think seeing that evolution on the energy transition not only helps us with these short-term issues, but also drives us towards better kind of long-term outcomes. So I'm an eternal optimist, but we've got to keep, particularly executives that are often incentivized over short term, we've got to keep them focused on that medium and long term, because this is not something that all of us know. This is a long term challenge that we've got that's going to solve over generations.
And Nick, just on that as well, there's a question that's come in from Rob, which is sharpening our attention on, I guess, the difference between what we see in the private sector, I guess, kind of private equity and VC versus listed. Are the majority of your clients from listed organisation, and do you see appetite from privately backed businesses to the same extent that we see across listed organisations?
I think it's both. I think if they're listed because they've got more fiduciary, NGOs, investors, the regulations apply sooner, particularly for UK listed companies, we know have to do TCFD next year, so that drives them. But even unlisted, actually, we see huge amounts of capital that's flowing from private equity. Money has to be raised in a sustainable manner. All of these companies, and where the private capital comes in, you've got the odd exception, obviously, in some of the wealth funds, but generally speaking, they've got a very high bar. They need to meet their own compliance about, Article 8, Article 9 type funds. So I think we see both in public and private sector the right drivers and behaviours to keep this at the top of the agenda, and long may that continue. And I think maybe there was one other question I saw about government versus private sector. I think the onus is on all of us, all the actors, myself, JP, Rachael are in the kind of private sector, but we need strong government policy. We need strong cooperation across financial services, energy and government, because no one can be held accountable for doing this on their own. So that's where, again, I get excited when we see that kind of collaboration across the different sectors, different markets, which is great to see.
Okay, perfect. And sorry, just had a question come in from Amy, which touches on this, which is that huge pressure equity funds, ESG targets, finance revenue driven. Can you highlight, or can anyone highlight the top priority measurable KPIs to focus from a practical delivery perspective?
Yeah, maybe I can say a few things on this. So it's of course it's a bit tricky to have this one KPI that's going to solve everything, right? So the obvious ones out there are scope 1, 2 emissions. Carbon itself, I would say that there's quite a bit of risk of gaming around this that goes on, especially with the scope 3 emissions. You could hide quite a bit of that. So there's some issues around that. So it's the one thing I would always caution about holding people accountable for one KPI and what that in itself might trigger. Carbon intensity is a slightly more sophisticated measure. That certainly in the energy industry is a useful one, where you don't just judge people on the size of the company, but also how efficient they run things, right? So that makes it a bit better, but that doesn't make the gaming on the scope 3, 2 piece go away, and to what extent you include things in there. I would argue personally quite a bit for net energy as a metric as well, because that is a more honest and fundamental metric, and I think that's frankly a little bit there's too little emphasis on that space, and I do see that becoming an increasingly more important one as investors get more sophisticated. I think more life cycle type analysis. So I think there is increasing sophistication happening in the sort of investment community, and certainly my effort with the institute is happening as people took a bit of some of the more unsophisticated ESG funds took quite a bit of a hit. So as they're getting more sophisticated, there's more of an interest in deeper, more underlying metrics.
Perfect, thanks, JP. And I'd love to get to Richard's question on value chain data, but I don't think we're going to quite get there, Richard. So perhaps we could pick up separately on that at another stage. And we are running very quickly out of time. So can I just ask each of you to kind of leave us with a final thought before I sign off? So JP, I can see you first. So over to you.
Okay, final words of wisdom. Well, yeah, I mean, just to recap, make sure you don't keep the whole ESG drive as a separate thing on the side by the board, but integrate it fundamentally in the business model of your company, how you make money, how you drive value, and how you mitigate risk. I think that's the key, and have this go low and wide into your company.
Nick?
It was a great one with JP, probably stole my thunder a bit, but I mean, I would say in the last 4 years, I've learned more, but I've never worked harder. So I think my takeaway, I think a lot of people, I saw a comment around COP saying new standards coming in with the ISSB, and someone wrote, oh, this is making it too hard for boards. Yes, it should be bloody hard for boards, because frankly, as a father of 3 daughters, this is the most important thing in our long-term, society to get right. So yeah, I would say be curious and learn and roll up your sleeves and get stuck in. And as JP says, doing it in a coordinated manner, whatever organization you're in, is always going to be the right way.
And finally, Rachel.
Yeah, just echo that, educate yourselves in ESG for sure. I always say the phrase, if not you, then who? Especially with this agenda, we've all got to get on board with it. I would say this next thing, which is please engage your procurement communities in this. As I say, we have access to the entire supply network, and not least, 10% to at least half of your company revenue is going out to these folks. So they've got a huge resource and role to play in that. So engage in your procurement teams. And if you don't have a procurement team, which I'm still shocked today that still exists, get one. I would say hire a CPO like JM did 5 years ago and get going with that. And then my final point is progress over perfection. Just get started.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm sure Gareth would fully agree with you on your point of hire a chief
Absolutely.
officer, at least the
And through BIE, obviously.
Of course. So thank you ever so much again to our panelists for taking part, and thank you all for attending. We will be releasing a recording of the webinar shortly, and also a write-up and debrief that we'll distribute. Thank you very much once again. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.